I define my niche differently. I define my niche as that owner-operator business owner who has a whole range of issues to deal with, has to wear 21 hats. Some of them they're ready to wear, some of them they're not. I'm hopeful that we can, in our conversations, in the content I publish, we can get to as many of them as possible.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Welcome to the Small Business Mentor podcast, where we shine a light on the black holes of business growth with your host, Alan Pence. In each episode, we explore the leaps and bounds entrepreneurs make as they push their businesses beyond the 1 million mark into the realm of professional sustainable growth. Stay with us as we navigate the journey from brute force to finesse.
All right, we are turning the tables today on the Small Business Mentor. We are interviewing the interviewer, Loren Feldman. He is a longtime journalist and community leader.
You didn't have to emphasize the long there, Alan.
He's like, well, usually the guys I'm interviewing are younger than me. So now, this is like my one opportunity, right? So, Loren, why don't you tell the folks here, like your history in this? I've been reading your stuff for probably 20 years. So go back through your involvement in small business and entrepreneurship.
Well, since I'm so old, Alan, that could take the whole podcast. I spent way too much time at my college newspaper and left myself with little choice but to be a journalist. As a result, I initially wanted to be a sports writer and then figured out that there were lots of other people who wanted to be sports writers and that my career might move faster if I got into business writing. And I had a little bit of a background. My degree was in economics. I thought that might be a good backup plan in case journalism didn't work out. So I was interested in it, but I also thought the best sports stories are people stories. The best business stories are people stories too. And just as in sports, in business, somebody's keeping score. It's not as public as it is in sports, but they're keeping score. And I thought, maybe my career will move more quickly. And it kind of did. For a long time, I focused on covering business at newspapers and then at magazines. I loved long form journalism when that was an economically viable option. Nobody told me that the internet was coming and changing everything. I hated it when what I enjoyed doing went away, but I also saw the internet as a really great opportunity. And I switched from print to internet when I was at Inc. magazine. I got involved in doing a number of kind of rethinking, rebranding exercises at magazines and wound up at Inc. when they hired a new editor who hired me to help. And I thought I would stay for a year or two and move on to the next project. But I kind of fell in love with it. I love the people I worked with at Inc. I love the people we covered. I knew something about business journalism. I knew nothing about entrepreneurship. And the more I learned, the more interested I got. So really for the past 20 years, I've been covering business owners and entrepreneurs. I love the puzzle building aspect of it. Why do certain businesses thrive? Why do others fail? And I've been doing that at Inc., the New York Times, at Forbes. And then I felt like we were missing something. So ultimately, I went out on my own and I'm trying to build a company called 21 Hats.
So you're the New York Times, you did You're the Boss column, right? Which was awesome. I love that. That actually was early in my entrepreneurial journey. I read a lot about Paul Downs and his numbers.
It's so nice of you to mention that and remember that. I had a great experience at all of the big companies that I worked at. The Times kind of hired me to create their version of Inc. magazine as sort of a web vertical, and I started that blog.
You were involved in Small Giants?
At Inc., I worked with Bo Burlingham, the author of Small Giants. I edited most of the stuff he wrote for the magazine. And when he wrote his book, Small Giants, he wrote a treatment of it that became a cover story for Inc., and I edited that. And I learned so much from Bo Burlingham. The first thing I realized when I got to Inc. was that I knew even less than I thought about entrepreneurship and that there were some really smart people here that I needed to follow around. And Bo was incredibly gracious, especially at events, at the Inc. 500 conference and places like that. I just stood by his side and met everybody that he was willing to introduce me to. And that was my education. And Small Giants, he figured out that there was this alternative, that it wasn't all companies trying to grow as quickly as possible, as big as possible, that there are these companies that, I think you got to be careful. It's not that they don't care about growth. It's not that they don't want to grow, but that's not the only goal. That's not the most important goal. They want to have a company that they're proud of, where they hire people that they enjoy working with and do things that are meaningful. And it's just a different way of thinking about building a business. And Bo's, the first person who really figured out that there was this community there waiting to be connected of business owners who were doing that and thought they were the only ones who were thinking that way.
So when do you think print journalism just broke? Was it like mid 2000s? Was there a year?
No, there wasn't a year. I forget who said it. There's a famous quote about how things crumble slowly and then all of a sudden.
All at once. That's from The Sun Also Rises. How did you go bankrupt? Right. Slowly and then all at once.
Exactly. I think it was that. But, the seeds were there all along. I worked at newspapers, and even when I switched to magazines, I knew people at newspapers. And I think we figured it out at magazines, some of it a little bit sooner. We realized that we had to compete for people's time. Newspapers didn't know that. If you talk to a newspaper journalist in the 1980s, you were likely to hear something along the lines of, "Oh, no, what are you talking about? We don't need to do marketing. People have to read us. It's their civic duty. It's their obligation." That wasn't a good strategy. It was a total misunderstanding of where the world was going, and it led to predictable results. And then the next problem was that even those who saw that the internet was going to change things didn't fully appreciate it. There were a lot of magazines, I worked for many of them, who thought, all right, our internet strategy is going to be, we'll take our monthly content and we'll publish it in print. We'll let it sit out there for a couple of weeks, and then we'll put it on the internet, and people will read it there, and we'll take comments, and it'll be great. And that wasn't really an internet strategy either. So people just didn't realize it. I worked at publications where there were a lot of turf battles, the people who were in print versus the people at the internet. And they didn't realize that they were on the same team and should have been pulling in the same direction. So there are a lot of reasons it happened. It just was a difficult thing to live through. Lots of people lost jobs because of it. And it's still going on. This year's been something of a bloodbath for big media companies, those who've managed to make it this far.
Well, I always said if Sam Zell couldn't figure out how to run a bunch of newspapers, nobody's going to figure it out. So,
well, that might not have been, he might have been a brilliant guy. That probably wasn't his best industry. So there are other people who knew media better than he did who failed as well.
I know. Well, his nickname was the Grave Dancer. And in that case, he actually brought the graveyard. So that was his big mistake. But anyway, so you went out and founded 21 Hats when?
2018.
So you've been at the game for 5 years.
Yeah, through various changes, I have to admit, I never had the courage to go out on my own as an entrepreneur until I did it. But when I did it because I had a partner. It was kind of my idea and his money. And he had a business that served entrepreneurs. And we thought we had a great plan, that he already wanted to build something of a platform for his existing customers. And I convinced him to think bigger and try to build the definitive platform for small business owners, which I didn't think existed out there, to try to create a community that would start with his existing entrepreneurs and business owners. I think we had a really good plan, but we ran into the pandemic, and it was an easy decision for me to leave when I did, because it was kind of the best of both worlds. He was bringing money to it. He gave me a raise to leave my job and work on a startup, which is not usually how it goes. It was too good to be true, and I should have realized that. Hit the pandemic. He had to pull back for a variety of reasons. And he was very decent about it. At a certain point, we parted ways on very good terms. He gave me the things that we had built together to try to make a go of it by myself, which I did. But, I found myself in, the fall of 2020, trying to figure this out by myself, which I've been doing ever since.
And so he was trying to monetize it through some separate business.
He had a book publishing business that connected largely business owners who wanted to write books with ghostwriters and handled the entire publishing process for them. He built a very successful company doing that. And then he bought several other companies that were aimed at entrepreneurs as well. I think he would be the first to tell you that he bought those companies a little bit too quickly. It was a little bit too much for his business to digest. It probably would have worked out fine, except then we ran into the pandemic and money got tight, and that was difficult. And that's when he had to back off what he was doing with me. But we thought it would initially be very profitable for his existing businesses. Whoever we attracted to the platform would learn about what he was already offering. It would help him that way. But the goal was to make the platform profitable in and of itself and be a standalone operational business.
So here you are, fall of 2020. You become an involuntary entrepreneur at that point, right? Or full owner, right? So then what was the approach? So you'd obviously built something by then, like the idea, a media business on its own, it can be very challenging. So what was your initial thought?
It was challenging, but in a lot of ways, although I didn't realize it at the time, it was a lucky break. I mean, I didn't have the guts to go off on my own without the support of someone else. But I loved being able to make all my own decisions and all my own mistakes. And, I think that has been a good thing since then. I also, in a weird sort of way, benefited from the pandemic, just in the sense that there was no reason for me to think that I could go back into journalism and get a job like the ones I had had previously. It was journalists were being let go left and right. I had no choice but to try to make this thing work. But also, we were kind of in lockdown and my kids were out of school. Kind of hit me at the right time in life. They were out of college. So I had free time. I had nothing better to do than to dig in and work as hard as I could to try to build this thing. So in a weird sort of way, the timing wasn't terrible. I had a daily email newsletter in which I was trying to aggregate the most important information of the day for business owners. I had a weekly podcast in which I was trying to create a peer group conversation. I had, up to 10 regulars who appeared on the podcast, and I would talk to 3 of them each week. And here's another way that I benefited from the pandemic. I wasn't sure how long I would keep that same group of entrepreneurs on the podcast. But when the pandemic hit, a couple of them actually did better than they would have without the pandemic, but some of them were really hanging on for dear life. And I think my listeners got invested in knowing, who's going to make it and who isn't. And it just made it very obvious that there was a never-ending supply of issues to talk about. So that's what we did.
That's great. So you're still doing daily newsletter and weekly podcasts?
Yes.
And so how is it okay to talk about numbers on how far you've grown that?
You can ask me anything.
How far have you grown the newsletter and maybe the podcast, a rough number?
The newsletter is about 6,500 subscribers. I get about a 30% open rate every day, whether my subject line is good or bad. And it grew pretty quickly. And then, to be honest, it has plateaued over the past year. To some extent, that's true with the podcast. As you either know or are learning, podcast analytics are a little frustrating because the podcasts go out on different platforms and they don't share their data. So it's hard to know a lot other than the number of downloads you get, which is somewhat helpful.
So that's great. So you've had some success building it, as you said, plateaued. And so your main ways of monetizing so far, you have an advertiser on the pod. So when did you start doing these in-person sessions, like kind of facilitated?
I guess I have 4 revenue streams that I'm kind of experimenting with. None of them are where I want them to be, but I think they all have some promise. It's, sponsorship. At times I've had sponsors for the newsletter and I have a sponsor for the podcast. I'm debating putting up a paywall for the newsletter. At one point, a couple of years ago, asked for voluntary subscription dollars. And I got a substantial number of them, but not anywhere close to what I was hoping for. I may put up a paywall there at some point. I have a monthly mastermind kind of CEO forum that I do that about 30 people or so pay for. And I've started doing in-person events. I did my first year ago, May, and I just did my second a couple of weeks ago in Fort Worth, Texas. And it sold out and went really well. And I think that's very promising for me for the future. Something I definitely got to build on.
So the idea is kind of building and like monetizing around community, like masterminds and personal events.
Exactly. My target audience, I suspect kind of like yours. I mean, I think we're kind of aiming at the same crowd, people who are, in the throes of building a business, not necessarily planning on an IPO or not necessarily taking venture capital, more of an owner operator kind of situation. And a lot of the people who do that can feel isolated. They don't necessarily find a group. There are a lot of others out there, but some of them find me. And when we gather in person, most of them don't know each other, but within 20 minutes or so, it feels like a family reunion. People start comparing notes. I'm sure you've had that experience as you've built your business. I know you've been involved in EO, and that's a similar kind of thing. There's nothing like sitting down with other people who kind of share what you're going through on your journey.
Yeah, exactly. I'm a huge fan of EO, YPO. I'm in a bunch of mastermind groups. I think peer coaching is one of the best things you can get. And spent a lot of time in my career floundering around without it. So got the benefit of it. So what I loved, is I listened to the pod this morning and they kind of turned at this event. The entrepreneurs kind of turned the tables on you, put you up on stage and said, Lauren, how are you monetizing and what's your business plan? So why don't you tell us a little bit about that and maybe some of the top ideas that you got out?
As you can imagine, it was, they did put me in the hot seat. It was, as you said at the beginning, I'm used to asking the questions. I'm not used to answering them. It was a challenging situation, but I brought it upon myself. One of my beliefs is I ask a lot of people tough questions, personal questions. On the podcast, I try to be respectful of people. And if somebody can't talk about something, they can't talk about it. But I've brought together a group of people who've talked openly about things like their mental health and really difficult years when they lost money and concerns about the business not succeeding. So if I ask other people to do that, I feel like I ought to be able to do it too. And I had a facilitator there named Chris Hutchinson, who works with a company called the Trebuchet Group. They do all kinds of leadership coaching, but I've seen Chris do this exercise that he calls a fishbowl, where he puts one person on the hot seat and says, tell us what your biggest challenge is. And then we're going to throw some ideas at you. We'll ask you questions. We'll split up into groups and brainstorm in the small groups. And then we'll come back together and throw our ideas at you. And there were a lot of people said very nice things. At times, I felt like I was at my own funeral where people were saying nice things about me, almost as if I wasn't there. And then at other points, there was some real tough love confrontation.
Tom Sawyer. You had a Tom Sawyer moment where you got to go to your own funeral.
Yes, exactly. But I feel like I'm at a point with the business where I do need to make some decisions. And I had a focus group of 25 or so entrepreneurs there who are familiar with what I'm trying to do. And what a great opportunity to hear what they're thinking and get their feedback. Some of it aligned with what I've been thinking. They definitely encouraged me to do the paywall. They think I don't value my offerings as much as I should, and that I should insist on getting paid more in various opportunities. I've found that, I think that's harder than they realize in some cases, but I'm going to take that take that message to heart and do my best. The paywall is scary because, I've thought about it all along. I don't want to inhibit growth, and there is the risk of that. But especially since my growth has plateaued a little bit anyway, I'm thinking maybe this is the time to do that. What did you find?
So what I was going to say is, well, first of all, I think one thing to highlight is there are a couple of people there who actually got pretty emotional about the help that they felt like you provided, particularly during the pandemic, helping people get through that. That was pretty powerful, I think. So huge compliment to you. So just to point that out. So I really resonated with a couple of things. First of all, was one that you brought up that wasn't one of the things that they talked about, but you had mentioned, which was when you first started talking about your event, somebody mentioned doing like manufacturing focused event. So I had this theory about media that I'm trying to figure out. I've been thinking through. And you look at what's happening with a lot of these things. So like you look at The Hustle gets sold to HubSpot, and more companies are looking at media as just like a lead gen source, right? And then I've looked at particularly what a lot of the guys on Twitter, but they have other followings as well, like Shane Purry, who does a podcast called My First Million. Nick Huber, who's guiding Sweaty Startup. They've spun up multiple businesses now, particularly the Sports Shepherd doing recruiting, offshore recruiting. Nick's spun up a cost seg business for real estate, a couple other things, all based on this distribution through media. And then the other real example I've seen is what Craig Fuller has done with FreightWaves. So he basically hired a journalist to start covering logistics and freight. And he's now built it into a data product, like series of data products about the freight industry. So he's giving you spot prices and all this different stuff. So anyway, you see this media as the driver of like a data business or like another business behind it. And I think that's sort of the future of niche media. So the one thing that I really resonated with was the manufacturing niche. And I think that's where you can really go deep. And it's almost to me like it's going to replace a lot of the functions of an association going forward. It's where people will come to meet and learn, get educated. And for that, I think you can charge quite a bit because it's a very specific vertical. And you got the modern, you have a rebirth in manufacturing in the United States. And I've seen it on Twitter and other places where there are a lot of people who don't even know the skills anymore, right? Because we've lost a lot of this stuff. And I think there's, so when you get that really focused niche kind of group, and it doesn't have to be manufacturing, I particularly resonated with that. I think that there's huge riches in those niches. So that was one that I really resonated with.
Well, let me respond to that because I'd be eager to hear what you think of this. That conversation happened because one person there asked me whether I'd thought about segmentation very much. And I volunteered that I've been worried about it since before we even launched the thing, because I did have a conversation with a friend who's a manufacturer who told me, I laid out my plans for what I plan to do with this thing and asked him what he thought. And he said, well, you're a friend, I'll give it a shot, but I got to be honest with you. I feel like the community I'm looking for is with other manufacturers. And if you're doing more of a general thing with businesses, business owners in lots of industries, I don't know if that's going to resonate with me. I'm not sure I'll stick with it. And I took that to heart, although you could argue I completely ignored it because that's not what I did, but I have worried about it ever since. So here's the thing. I define my niche differently. I define my niche as that owner-operator business owner who has a whole range of issues to deal with, has to wear 21 hats. Some of them they're ready to wear. Some of them they're not. Hopeful that we can, in our conversations, in the content I publish, we can get to as many of them as possible. But it means we're not going as deep as we might if we were focusing in just a handful of areas. I mean, I'd love to be a big company and go deep in all of those areas, manufacturing, finance, management.
Well, I was going to say that, I think that it probably isn't an either or. So my question would be, you do a lot of this solo, right? So you're editing, you're recruiting, you're blah, blah, blah. And if you really think about what is it that Lauren does well, it's the conversations with the people. All that other stuff is a bunch of admin. So there is possibility, I think, for you to extend what you do just by bringing on some resources potentially to cover all that other stuff. So you're just like the talent doing the interview. And that way, I think you could probably do. So I don't think it's an either or. I think you probably have a base thing and then hey, I'm going to go do this manufacturing. Because here's what I think you can charge for the manufacturing a lot more because it's very niche specific and it's going to help someone do their job that day more than the general.
What do you mean when you say charge for the manufacturing? You're talking about content focused on manufacturing?
Yeah. I think there is a debate here I would have between, and I was going to say this about the paywall for the newsletter. There's a debate I would have between how valuable is charging for the newsletter podcast versus charging more for the events. So there could be a trade-off there, right? Where it's hey, I want the podcast and the newsletter to be free because really they're driving people to the events and that's where I make my money. But there is possibility that the deeper you get on a niche, you can really start charging for a newsletter. Ben Thompson does Stratechery, right? Very focused on tech. And he does kind of a blended paywall, right? He does one big piece that's public and then two other pieces a week that are beyond the paywall. But if this is something people are reading to really learn how to run their company, like in manufacturing, then they're going to be much more likely to pay for it. And so I would have to think through, like, you probably don't charge for it at first, you probably leave it open, and then you really start charging for the events. And I bet you could double or triple the amount you're charging for the events because they become very relevant to that person's job and become a real business expense.
One of the things I've thought about is trying to bring the collective wisdom of a group of entrepreneurs together in kind of a workshop environment. So one of the things where I think I would like to go deep and could do it now, even without those additional resources, is with something like thinking through succession and transitions. The podcasts that I've published over the past year that have had the most downloads all have the word ESOP in them. As we all know, there's this silver tsunami. There are lots of people who have been running a business, owning a business for a long time and trying to figure out what they're going to do with it. There are a lot of issues about that. It's tricky because there are a million different options. Nobody knows them all. And it's very hard to go to one place and get all your questions answered. So a workshop where you brought together 10 people who are doing their own research, exploring their options, wanting to talk it over with other people on a similar path, I think could be really valuable. And then I would bring in experts who know ESOPs, who know employee ownership trusts, who know private equity, who know any other option.
So here is so you just set me up for my second thing. If you're going to stay more general, I think that, well, one is there is a part about this, like growing the audience. And I think we should talk about that too. But assuming you can keep growing your audience, I do think that there are look at these models of like Nick Huber and Shane Puri taking equity in companies and helping them grow. So what if you're doing a deal with, somebody who does ESOPs or somebody who does a business broker? So you're taking a cut, I'm going to build this. If you say you did a whole track, that's all you did is exits, right? You could probably start a brokerage with somebody and be like, okay. So I think that's the way you really build it into like big money thing, is like, it is some kind of follow on. And it's not something you would run necessarily, but something you would partner with somebody on and be like a service / usually probably some kind of service for the customer set, which I know like is anathema to journalists, right? Because it's like cutting across the line. But I do think this is the future, right?
It may be, I've thought about it just in terms of something as simple as affiliate marketing. I've had lots of people approach me wanting to drop ads into the newsletter. And if somebody buys their service, I get a cut of it. And I've done a little bit of it, but only with companies where I really knew the owner and the business, and I felt I could confidently include them.
And in this case, you're actually building the company with somebody. So it's like sort of your company, right? So it's not like some rando person you're sending them off to for tax services.
There are ways to do that I think I could get comfortable with. But you're right. I mean, I think credibility is an important thing, and I don't want to burn it unnecessarily.
So this is the part of me that's like the business owners coming after you are like, hey, look, you got to hustle. One thing I would say is I did notice out of it, a lot of the people we're targeting, right? So these are mostly bootstrap entrepreneurs. They're not VC funded, these kind of people. So that's a little different. But most of them are salespeople, right? They're of some sort. They might not have been trained that way, but they're almost all good at sales.
Not necessarily by profession. It's not like they were salespeople and then they started a business. They started a business, and it's like I'm the furthest thing from a salesperson, but I'm pretty good at selling 21 hats when I need to be, because I'm passionate about it. I'm living it. I believe in it. And that's what happens, I think, to every entrepreneur. They become a salesperson, and no one will ever sell it as well as they do because it's in their blood.
So my thing is, I think you still have this residue of the old journalistic integrity hanging over you. You just got to punch through that and start realizing that the future is these kind of combos. Anyway, I thought those were the two things that I heard that were screaming out at me, is like, go really niche, and it's not either or. You could pick a couple of niches, and if you can fund some more support for yourself, you can build that niche. And that's, to me, that's where you can really make money out of the community thing. And then I do think there's this other kind of more general thing where you're partnering with some service that helps business owners. And I thought the other piece that I saw is, again, this is an effort thing, I think, is like going more omni-channel. So like posting what you're doing on YouTube, making sure your content's on X. Like this is what I found too, is like, it's very difficult. I hired an agency that helps me produce my podcast. They help me build all my social media. They produce it, cut it up for me. So I don't really do it, but it's just that omni-channel is hard to feed. But I do think that that's like where things are going. It's like, you got to push on every channel. Those are the three things I took from your talk.
I think that all makes sense. Given my limited bandwidth, I have chosen to focus more on LinkedIn than some of the other channels. I think the people I'm trying to reach are more present there. I know what you're talking about on Twitter, or X, I suppose we should say. That's an audience that I haven't really gone after, kind of the search holdco audience, and one that I probably should reach out to more. It's obviously a really thriving, growing slice of entrepreneurship.
Well, and particularly if you have a bunch of people looking to sell who are like, hey, I'm interested in ESOPs. Connect them with all these people they're trying to buy. There's a great community there. And then the other thing I was just going to say, I don't have an answer to, but I would really think about this. Is my newsletter and podcast an entry point for me to do more events? Or is it really the thing I'm selling? And that's where I would decide about charging, because if it really is an entry point and you really want to make your money off the charging for and I know people told you to charge more for the events, right?
They were attending the event, and maybe there was some built-in bias to that. I think they wanted me to charge for other things, not necessarily for the event.
But there were some people originally who told you to charge more, right? And you said you kind of came in between, right?
That's absolutely right.
That's the only thing I thought when I was hearing people tell you to charge for the newsletter. It's like, I don't know. If you're going to really develop these events and really turn them into a recurring thing, that's where I would charge more and then focus on the revenue generation there. I just think you always should know where your value creation is that you want to focus and put most of your time, and then make everything else free and try and make your money there. But that might not be it. It might be like, hey, I really want to turn this newsletter into the thing. Like for me, if I was going to buy a newsletter, it'd be like, it's got to be telling me something different about how to run my business that I'm not getting somewhere else. And then if I see that, it becomes like my daily thing that helps me rethink about my business or something like that. Or is it like, hey, it's sort of a general newsletter. I want to get as many people in as possible. And then I really want to take them to this event. And I'm going to sell the event a lot, right? That's what I would think about a little bit.
I think you're making really good points. The newsletter as it exists is more general. It's not a guide to how you should run your business, but I think people do get value out of it, because you mentioned the people who felt that 21 Hats helped them make it through the pandemic. What they were referring to was my collecting crucial information about things like what to do if you can't get the attention of your bank and you need a PPP loan. And for some people who, were just really flailing, this was a lifeline to information they needed to get the help they needed. There's definitely stuff in there it's mostly aggregation. When I come up with something that I think describes a really useful strategy in terms of digital marketing or something like that, I'm all over it. But I can't promise that there's going to be something in there every day that's going to help you improve your business, although I would like that to be the case. And if I ever have a team working with me, I certainly could make that the case. And my hope is that at some point that might happen. The tricky thing with the events is, I don't know if I can make all my money through the events. I don't know how many I can do in a year, and I don't know how big I can let them get. The point of these events that I've done so far it's been based on the idea that most people I've attended conferences with, when I ask them what they think of the conference, they usually say some version of, I like this speaker, I like that speaker, these others I could have done without. I just wish there'd been more time to get to know the other people who attended the conference. So I decided to do events that are all about that. It's like a 3-day peer group session where people share what their challenges are and look for, common threads that they can kick around together and make connections that will be meaningful going forward. I had 24, 25 people at this one. I don't think I can make it too much bigger than that in that format. Now, maybe there's another kind of meeting or event that I could do, but the ones that have worked so far do have a limit.
And then you're doing some masterminds too, you said?
I'm doing a monthly Zoom call.
So that could be something you could grow too, like do more masterminds.
I'm hoping. Again, it's the same issue. I'm not competing with Vistage or EO, we're not sitting down for a full day and opening our books and getting into the nitty gritty. I'm doing it for an hour or an hour and a half. And it's more informal. It's like, what's going on? What are you facing? What are your challenges today? I think people have clearly found value in it because they keep coming and they keep paying me for it. I have to be clear, it's not a substitute for some of the things that you've done and others, that are available to others. And I have to figure out the same issue of segmentation and how deep you want to go.
Well, Cody Sanchez is running like 100 of these things, making like 10K a piece. So like, it feels like you've got a lot of the stuff in place, and like maybe it's just about growing a few of them a little bit, maybe figuring out what it would take to bring in some help so you can, because when you're doing it all yourself, it's pretty tough to grow anything like that, right?
My hope has been that, I can experiment with these things, see what connects best, drive a little revenue, and at a certain point, start hiring a team. That would be my goal.
But I'm going to still be thinking about this, what kind of equity position you can take in a business to bring in. I think that to me is the new playbook that people are doing. And I'm trying to think through it myself. That's part of the reason I'm doing this podcast, is kind of figure it out. And I've been thinking about different kinds of business models. So I'm giving myself advice.
I do think there is a way to do that kind of partnership. The thing that would be most comfortable to me would be like if I'm doing a workshop on succession and I bring in 5 experts who have different approaches that they are selling. If I have an interest in each of those, and I'm not pointing everybody towards one in particular and saying, this is the one you should be doing, I think I could find some level of comfort with that.
That's a good idea, actually. It's just like kind of a limited. So it's like, hey, out of this, if you got X number of clients, no guarantees, we have like a little split. That's a cool idea, actually, particularly if you do it focused on some areas that have that value.
I think it's important that, we have an open conversation. So if there's somebody in the workshop who says, I tried that and it didn't work for me, and here's why, I'm not shutting them down because I have a financial stake in, the thing that they are criticizing.
I think you should get everybody that's interested in selling and have a big conference with all the like Holdco bros on Twitter, and it would be like a bonanza. You could match make, you could take a cut of every deal.
It's funny you say that. It just astounds me. I don't know if you saw it. I actually highlighted in my newsletter. The New York Times the other day ran a story where they basically discovered search funds. I think it was the first time they've written about a search fund, which just boggles my mind because, if I had stayed there, we would have written about it a long time ago. And I think it's a really interesting thing. The entrepreneurs that I cover, mostly the bootstrappers, they haven't heard of it. They don't know that it exists. And yet these worlds need to come together, just as you suggested. I think I'm going to do this. I want to do a podcast where I have somebody who's an MBA, who's a searcher, who bought a roofing company or a plumbing business. And then I'm going to have somebody who owns a plumbing business because they started out changing toilets and eventually took over the business, and compare notes on what worked for them, what isn't working for them, what they can learn from each other. And I'm convinced they can both learn from each other, that there's no right answer.
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, I got some recommendations for you on the first category. The other thing I would mention on ESOPs. So if you end up doing that, let me know, because I'm a huge fan of this company called Alpha Architect. They were Philadelphia based, but they actually run ETFs and stuff. So they're not generally known in this space, but they ended up hiring this guy in, and they have a different approach for how owners can get qualified replacement property. So that's how you avoid the taxes. So like if you sell more than 30% of your company to your employees, you don't have to pay capital gains as long as you invest the money into what's called qualified replacement property. And usually the way they do that is by buying a structured note from a big company. And those notes are horrible deals. They're just like fee ridden, and they're terrible. So what they did is they figured out, because you're not allowed to invest in companies that make too much money overseas or make too much money from non-operating activities. So like you couldn't buy Berkshire or something like that. So what they've done is they've basically built a way to create like an index fund for you using individual stocks that are all qualified replacement property. And then they run that for you over time. You can borrow against it. And then as one stock goes up, one stock goes down, they can do tax loss harvesting. So over time, you never have to realize the taxes, and you never have to buy one of these crappy structured notes. I haven't done it, but I have no affiliation with them. But I just thought it was like the first thing I was like, oh, everyone should do this if they're going to do it. Because if you go to an ESOP and you really do it right, you get another turn of EBITDA in return by not paying taxes. If you're selling for 4, you get 5 times, right? It's great.
ESOPs are amazing. They're so amazing because they're so complicated. And when it works, it can work really well. And I know lots of people who've done it and swear by it. But I also know people who've spent a ton of money pursuing it and then walked away at the last minute because they decided it wasn't for them. They didn't want to live with that. I feel like I've devoted a couple of years to peeling the onion and trying to understand better, but there's always something more. And you just gave a perfect example of that. I've never heard of this business.
Well, I think it's fascinating that some of your most downloaded or viewed content. So I think there's something there. There's a lot of owners looking around. That's an avenue that I think for an owner who still wants to kind of run the company, I think it's a really good opportunity to begin the transition process. Because I do think that somebody who throws you're throwing a bunch of debt on the company usually if you're getting your money up front. And if you're doing that and walking away, most companies just don't have the management strength or bench to really manage through that kind of debt load. But anyway, we're not here to talk about these stuff. We're here to talk about Lauren's business. So I'm really excited to hear what you do with all these ideas you got. I think I'd really love to see you develop that event business. And there's a lot there. And hopefully you can bring on some staff soon so you don't have to do it all yourself.
I appreciate that. You know what? The events are just fun. And I mean, it's a family reunion, I think, for the people who show up there, but for me too. I just feel like it's actually an interesting business model. I mean, by eliminating speakers, you're eliminating one of the biggest expenses of meetings. It gives me more money to spend on, restaurant food and stuff like that. But to me, it's like, I mean, I love playing baseball when I was a kid. I loved going to baseball summer camp. Being at these events to me is like being at summer camp again.
When's your next event? Have you planned it yet, or?
I wanted to survive this one, and then I'm going to decide. As you heard, and as you said, they think I might be able to do 2 a year. So I might try to pull one off in the fall. If not, it'll be, March next year. But I think I might shoot for late October, something like that.
We'll have to check in again. I love hearing people trying to build niche media businesses. It's great.
Well, that's exactly what you're doing here. I've been enjoying following yours. You're off to a great start. You've had really good people, and I hate having smart competition.
It's not really competition.
I was going to say, there's plenty of business for all of us here. I think we're going after similar kinds of companies, and I think it's a great place to be. The more traditional thing to do is to talk to people who've had huge success, who try to remember what the challenges were like in the early days. But you're doing what I really admire, which is talking to people who are still fighting the good fight and still figuring it out and learning things every day. And to me, that's what makes this fun to do and why I enjoy listening to your stuff.
Yeah, well, it's a great, I always say business ownership is like, it's the thing that'll test you the most, but it's the greatest thing. Like you can't have rose-colored glasses about the world after you go into business.
That's exactly it. So many people talk about, they give you the happy talk. It's, you just got to follow your passion and everything will be fine. And you know what? It's not always fine.
Well, this is great, Lauren. And so everyone should subscribe to 21 Hats, the newsletter. Visit our website,
21hats.substack.com, or you can just go to 21hats.com, my website, and you can find the podcast, the 21 Hats podcast, wherever you get podcasts.
Download an Apple. I listen to it every week. It's fantastic. Got to have Liz on again soon. I haven't heard her for a little bit. Lauren and I kind of got to know each other. We have a mutual friend I went to business school with.
Liz Picarazzi, who owns City Bin, and she's going to be recording an episode on Thursday, I believe. So you will hear her soon.
Well, I look forward to it. Lauren, thanks so much for doing this. We appreciate it.
My pleasure, Alan. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to the Small Business Mentor podcast, brought to you by Alan Pence. For more insights on how to navigate your business through its black holes, visit @apence on X. Don't forget to search for Small Business Mentor in your podcast app to subscribe. Thank you for joining us, and here's to your next leap in business growth.